The alarm on my wrist screamed before I even understood what it was screaming about. I was 6 kilometers from the outpost, deep inside the verdant range, when the signal cut through my helmet like a blade. It was not our frequency. It was not any frequency I had ever logged in 3 years of survey work on this planet. My hands were shaking before my mind caught up with the danger. I should have turned back right there. Every rule drilled into me by the colony command said so. Unknown signal, unknown source, unknown risk. Report it. Do not investigate alone. Wait for backup. I did not wait. Something in that broken, stuttering pulse pulled at me, the way a cry for help pulls at anyone who still has a heart left in their chest. I changed direction and started running across loose rock, my breath loud in my own ears, my legs burning long before I reached the ravine where the signal was strongest. That is where I found her. The wreckage looked like nothing I had ever seen, twisted metal that shimmered faintly even in the dust, half swallowed by the rocks it had crashed into, and underneath a broken piece of the hull, pinned and bleeding, was something that should not have existed. A woman, if I can even call her that, with skin the color of storm clouds and blood that ran a deep violet instead of red. Her arms had more joints than mine, bending in ways that made my stomach twist, but her eyes were wide and dark and afraid, and there was no mistaking what lived behind them. Someone was in there. Someone was dying and terrified and utterly alone. I did not think about protocol. I did not think about the danger of touching something unknown, something that could have carried diseases my body had no defense against, something that could have been hostile for all I knew. I only thought about the sound she made when she saw me, a broken gasp that was unmistakably a plea. I dropped to my knees beside her and started pulling at the wreckage with my bare hands. The metal was sharp. It cut into my gloves, then my skin, and I barely noticed. She flinched away from me at first, her long fingers curling into fists, every instinct in her telling her to fight or run from the strange creature looming over her. I forced myself to move slowly, to speak low, even though I knew she could not understand a single word. "I am not going to hurt you," I said, again and again, like a chant. "I am going to get you out. Just hold on." Whether it was my tone or the desperation in my eyes, something in her shifted. She stopped fighting me. She let me pull the broken metal away from her legs, let me press my hands hard against a wound on her side that bled far too fast for comfort. Her blood soaked through my gloves, warm just like mine, and somehow that single detail steadied me more than anything else could have. I did not have a medkit built for her kind of body. I had nothing but pressure and prayer, and the stubborn refusal to let her slip away in front of me. I called for emergency transport, my voice cracking, as I gave coordinates that made no sense to the dispatcher on the other end, coordinates for a location that should have held nothing but empty rock. "There is someone here," I said. "She is hurt. She needs help now." The response crackled with confusion, then alarm, then finally the crisp tone of someone mobilizing a team. I did not wait for them to arrive. I lifted her, one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees, and I started walking back toward the outpost, with her weight pressing into my chest, her blood soaking through my suit, her breath shallow and uneven against my collarbone. She gripped my arm the entire way, her too many jointed fingers locking around me with a strength that surprised me, given how weak she seemed. It was not aggression, it was fear. It was the universal, desperate need for something solid to hold on to when everything else in your world has gone wrong. I held on to her too. By the time we reached the outpost, our small medical team had scrambled into something resembling readiness. Dr. Ellery Vance took one look at her and went pale, but to her credit, she did not hesitate. She grabbed instruments, called for equipment we did not usually need, and started working with the kind of focused urgency that saves lives. "We do not know her physiology," Ellery said, her hands already moving. "We do not know what will help her and what will kill her." "Then we figure it out," I said, "right now." We worked through the night. I held pressure on wounds while Ellery tried to understand organs that made no sense according to any textbook she had ever studied. The alien woman's vital signs spiked and dropped in ways that terrified us both. But somehow, through sheer stubbornness and improvisation, we kept her breathing until dawn broke over the ridge outside. When she finally opened her eyes again, clear and lucid instead of clouded with pain, the first thing she did was find my face across the room and stare. as if trying to memorize it. I did not know then that I would spend years memorizing hers in return. Word of what happened spread through the colony faster than any of us expected. By the following afternoon, a message arrived from Regional Command, cold and efficient, ordering that the alien survivor be transferred to a research facility on the next transport ship. They wanted to study her. They wanted to understand her species, her technology, her biology, everything that made her different from us. I refused, before I even understood why I was refusing so fiercely. She is not a specimen, I told the outpost director, my voice louder than I intended. She is a person who nearly died. She needs care, not a laboratory. The argument that followed lasted 2 full days. I fought harder than I had fought for anything in my life, using every regulation I could find about medical stabilization periods, about the risks of transporting a critically injured being before she was strong enough to survive the journey. In the end, I only won by putting my own name on the line, promising to take personal responsibility for her recovery and her safety. They agreed, reluctantly, giving me a narrow window before review boards would revisit the decision. I did not care about narrow windows. I only cared that she was safe for now. Her name, or the closest sound my mouth could manage of it, became Vesa. She told it to me herself, 3 days after she woke, using a small device strapped to her wrist that slowly began translating fragments of her language into something we could understand. It crackled and stuttered constantly, offering broken words instead of full sentences, but it was enough. It was a beginning. Vesa, she said, pointing to herself, her dark eyes steady despite everything her body had been through. Daniel, I answered, pointing to my own chest. She repeated it slowly, testing the shape of it in her mouth, and something about hearing my name from her lips made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect. The weeks that followed were nothing like I imagined they would be. I thought caring for an injured alien would be clinical, distant, careful in the way you are careful around something fragile and foreign. Instead, it became something else entirely. Vesa was sharp. She was curious about everything, from the shape of our chairs to the way sunlight moved across the outpost windows throughout the day. She asked questions constantly, first through gestures, then through the stumbling translator, then eventually in halting words of our own language that she picked up faster than any of us thought possible. I spent my evenings teaching her. Simple words at first: water, food, pain, safe. She absorbed them like she had been starving for language her whole life, repeating them under her breath long after our lessons ended, practicing alone in the quiet of her room. In return, she taught me fragments of her own language, strange sounds that required a different kind of breathing than I was used to, words that had no direct translation, but carried feelings I somehow understood anyway. She taught me the word her people used, for someone who comes back for you when they have no reason to. She said it quietly one evening, looking at me with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "That is what you did," she said, "for me." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and she seemed to understand that silence sometimes carries its own kind of answer. Not everyone in the colony was comfortable with her presence. Some avoided her entirely, unsettled by her appearance, by the way her joints moved, by the memory of the crash and the questions it raised about who else might be out there in the sky above us. A few were openly hostile, muttering about security risks and unknown contamination, pushing again for her transfer to a research facility where she could be studied under controlled conditions. I stood between her and those voices more times than I can count, not because I saw myself as some kind of hero. I did not feel brave. I simply could not stomach the idea of her being reduced to data points after everything she had survived. Ellery, to her credit, became one of Vesa's strongest advocates, arguing that forcing an unstable transfer could kill a patient who had already proven remarkably resilient. Between the two of us, and Vesa's own quiet, steady strength in the face of suspicion, we kept the pressure at bay long enough for something more permanent to take root. Months passed. Vesa grew stronger, both in body and in her grasp of our language. She started helping around the outpost in small ways, first simple tasks, then more complex work, once people realized how quickly she learned. Her mind moved differently than ours, seeing patterns and connections the rest of us missed, and slowly, grudgingly, Even her harshest critics began to respect what she brought to the colony. I found myself seeking her out more and more, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. We took walks along the edge of the outpost in the evenings, when the twin moons rose over the ridge, and the air cooled enough to be comfortable. She asked about my life before the colony, about the family I had left behind on a planet she would never see. I asked about hers, though those conversations came slower, heavier, weighted with things she was not yet ready to share. One evening, nearly a year after I found her in that ravine, she asked if we could go back there. Why? I asked, surprised by the request. I want to see it, she said, not as the place where I almost died, as the place where I did not. We walked there together under a darkening sky, and when we reached the edge of the ravine, she stood quietly for a long time, staring down at the spot where the wreckage had been cleared away months earlier. Then she turned to me, her dark eyes steady in a way that made my breath catch. "You did not hesitate," she said. "I have thought about that every day since. Everyone else would have called for orders and waited. You just came." "I could not leave you there," I said. "It was not a decision. It was just what I did." "That is why I trusted you," she said, "even before I understood a single word you spoke." We stood there as the moons rose fully, and something between us shifted from friendship into something neither of us said out loud, not yet, but both of us clearly felt. It took another year before either of us was brave enough to speak it plainly. Vesa had grown fully into her strength by then, both physically and within the colony itself, respected for her intelligence, her steady calm, her quiet resilience. She had become someone the colony leaned on, not despite being different, but because of the perspective her difference brought. I remember the night I finally told her how I felt. We were sitting outside the medical building where I had once held pressure on her wounds through a long and terrifying night, and I found myself telling her that the fear I felt that night had never really left me. Not fear of her, but fear of losing her, a fear that had only grown stronger the longer I knew her. She listened quietly, then reached out and took my hand in hers, her fingers folding around mine, in a way that no longer felt strange or foreign, only familiar and right. "I feel the same," she said. "I did not expect to feel at home on a planet that was never mine, but I do, because of you." From that night forward, we were no longer just two people who had survived something terrible together. We were building something new, something neither of us had a name for at first, until eventually, the shape of it became clear enough that we did not need one. Not everyone accepted it easily. Some in the colony struggled with the idea of a human, and someone so entirely different building a life together. There were uncomfortable conversations, cold stares, quiet judgments passed in hallways when they thought we could not hear. We faced it together, the same way we had faced everything else, steady and unwilling to let fear dictate what we chose to build. 2 years after the crash that brought her into my life, I asked her to marry me, standing in that same ravine where it had all begun. I did not plan some elaborate speech. I simply told her that I could not imagine building a future with anyone else, that the moment I pulled her from that wreckage had somehow, impossibly, been the moment my whole life started making sense. She said yes without a single second of hesitation, the same way I had run toward her signal without hesitation 2 years earlier. It felt fitting, somehow, that neither of us waited when it mattered most. Our wedding was small, held at the outpost with the people who had come to know and respect her over those 2 years standing witness. Ellery cried through most of it, insisting it was allergies, though none of us believed her for a second. Vesa wore a simple dress, adapted to fit her unique frame, and I wore the same worn jacket I had been wearing the day I found her, because she asked me to, saying it felt right to have it there. Life after that settled into something steady and good. Vesa continued working alongside the colony's engineers, her knowledge of materials and systems from her own world proving invaluable as the settlement expanded. I continued my survey work, though I found myself drawn less to distant signals now and more to the life we were building close to home. 3 years into our marriage, she told me she was carrying our child. I do not have words strong enough to describe what that moment felt like. Fear and joy tangled together so tightly I could not separate them. Fear because none of us knew what such a pregnancy would mean for either her body or the child's. Joy because somehow, impossibly, we were about to become a family, in a way neither of us had ever imagined possible. The pregnancy was not easy. Ellery worked tirelessly alongside specialists brought in from off-world, monitoring every stage with a caution that bordered on obsession, determined not to lose either Vesa or the child to complications no one fully understood. There were nights I sat beside her bed, holding her hand the same way I had held it through translation lessons and quiet evening walks, terrified in a way I had not been since that first night in the ravine. Vesa remained calm through most of it, calmer than I managed to be, drawing on some deep well of steadiness that had carried her through crash landings and cultural upheaval and everything in between. "We survived worse," she reminded me one night, when my hands would not stop shaking. "We will survive this too." She was right. Our daughter was born on a quiet morning, with more joints in her small arms than a human child should have, and exactly the right number for what she was, something entirely new that belonged fully to neither world and completely to both. Vesa held her the moment she was strong enough, cradling her with a tenderness that made the entire room go still. I remember looking at the two of them together and thinking about that ravine, about the signal I almost ignored, about the version of my life where I turned back toward the outpost instead of running toward danger. That version of me never existed in the timeline I was living, and I have never once regretted the choice that brought me here instead. We named our daughter Alara, a name that belonged to neither of our worlds specifically, but felt entirely ours together. She grew quickly, curious about everything the same way her mother had once been curious about the strange new world she found herself stranded in. She asked constant questions, about the stars, about the colony, about the two very different people who had somehow become her parents. Sometimes, in the evenings, she asks how her mother and I met. "Your mother was hurt," I tell her, keeping the story simple the way children need it kept, and I could not leave her there. "That is it?" she asks, unimpressed, the way children often are with the stories that shaped their entire existence without them realizing it. "That is it," I say, smiling. But Vesa, listening from the doorway the way she always does during these conversations, adds the rest in her own quiet, steady voice. "He did not just save my life," she tells our daughter. "He looked at something he did not understand, and chose kindness instead of fear. That is the part that matters most." I think she is right, though I did not understand it myself back then, standing in that ravine with blood on my hands and fear in my chest. It was never really about the rescue itself. It was about everything that came after. The years of choosing each other quietly and steadily, one ordinary evening at a time, until an alien woman bleeding out in a ravine became the very center of everything I am. Some nights, when the twin moons rise over the ridge the way they did that first evening we returned to the crash site together, Vesa and I still walk out there, just the two of us, watching Alara chase after fireflies near the edge of the rocks. We do not talk much on those walks anymore. We do not need to. We simply stand there, together, grateful for the signal I almost ignored, grateful for the choice that changed the entire direction of both our lives, grateful for everything that unfolded, because one ordinary day, I heard something calling for help, and I chose to answer.